Hello everyone, welcome to The Vibe. My name is Ethan or EJ Gonzalez, your host, and you are currently listening to the first episode of the Visualize podcast. I'm so excited, you guys. Oh my gosh, I hope everyone is doing well. I hope everyone is healthy. Thank you so much for stopping by and listening to the pod. Before we get started, I kind of want to just formally introduce myself to everyone, or to anyone who is just stopping by for the first time. As I mentioned, my name is Ethan, or EJ, short for Ethan Jonas Gonzalez. I guess in professional terms, you could say that I am an aspiring content creator. But really, I really like making art, man. I like expressing myself through many different avenues. Obviously, I like filmmaking and making videos. A lot of people ask me, what's my niche? What type of videos I like to make on YouTube? And I always say, I just like to make aesthetically pleasing content, honestly, about life, about fashion. I also like photography. I love experimenting with different, devices to capture photos, whether that be a DSLR or a film camera, or even like my iPhone. I love experimenting with photography as well. Not only that, I like writing. I love to write. I love to tell stories. There's so much power in writing, and it's so beautiful sometimes, or all the time. Writing is so beautiful. I mean, through poetry, through narratives, through just whatever, I like writing as well. And even fashion. I believe that, fashion is art, style is art, and you can definitely express yourself through that. So there are many different ways that I like to express myself, and I hope, you enjoy that here on this podcast. So what is this podcast about? What is Visualize, right? I think the way I would describe Visualize, or just this podcast in general, is seeing and understanding life through different lenses, and ultimately visualizing life in a better perspective. That's really, in general, what this podcast is about. And, you could consider it as like a personal stories podcast, or this podcast could be considered as comedy, because we're going to giggle here and there through this podcast. But, I would also consider this, the Visualize podcast, as even like a self-care podcast, something to listen to in the car, or, while cleaning up, or even while doing homework. I don't know. But, and even like, I would also consider this as a faith podcast as well, since I'll be talking about, my faith. But, if anything, with the Visualize podcast, I want to make it clear that everyone and anyone is welcomed here, is loved here, and is appreciated here. And kind of sounds cliche when I'm like, I want to make this like a safe space for everyone. But no, I genuinely want to make this podcast, a place where everyone could just vibe, and everyone can just talk about stuff and have great conversations. I want this podcast to be a place where, yes, I share my own experiences, but I'm also able to amplify different stories and voices of other people in this podcast. So yeah, everyone is welcome here. This is a dope podcast. With that being said, I kind of just wanted to get into the main portion of this podcast. This is just really an introduction. I will say this episode is gonna be quite short compared to other ones I plan to have in the future. But really, if anything, I feel like this is, so basically I'm a sophomore in college currently, and we just started our semester, and really depending on the instructor, some instructors before the first day of school, they'll send you an assignment, they'll send you a syllabus to go over, but again, it really just depends on the instructor. But for me, on the first day, many instructors just went through our syllabus, and this is kind of the vibe I'm giving right now. It's like an instructor showing to the class their syllabus. Anyways, so really I wanted to talk about how I got to here, how I got to creating Visualize, how Visualize came about. This is definitely not my first, episode or even podcast. If you don't know, I've had a podcast before, and if you've been with me for a while in terms of my content creation journey, you may remember that in 2021, summer of 2021, I started a podcast called Sige. And man, it took me a minute because there's so much to get into with that podcast. In hindsight, and just in general, that was definitely an experimental phase for me in terms of my content creation journey. Number one, because I was trying to figure out like the type of content I want to create as a creator. I love podcasts. I think they're super dope. I think that you can have really great conversations and just make really cool stuff through podcasts. But also I was trying to figure out the type of person I wanted to be on this platform, online, while making, content, right? And man, I think when I made not social media, when I made Sige, if anything, I just felt that it wasn't me. That first podcast that I made, it was super exciting. The process of making the name and the advertisement. I remembered I would hit up a lot of people, to just promote my podcast. And I'm super grateful and thankful for that. But if anything, it's so hard to explain, but I feel like that podcast, I just wasn't myself. And that really impacted me so much because, you start questioning your, the reason as to why you're doing this. Are you doing a podcast to, impact people for the better, or just for the views and for the likes? When I mean I wasn't myself, I feel like I was just trying to create this persona so that everyone could like me. I feel like back then it was yo, what's up, homie, blah, blah, blah. But now I feel like, in hindsight, I was I don't know if I'm really like that, I feel like and not to say I was faking it or anything, but there just came a point where, the content creation of a podcast, of that podcast in particular, was kind of draining. It was wow, I don't feel myself. It came to a point where it kind of turned into burnout, creative burnout. Man, I don't know what I want to do anymore. I just feel like I didn't have my priorities straight. I really just was doing it for the views, kind of, I what I mean by that is I was stuck on the analytics all the time. I would be super excited if I gained one viewer or one listener on this podcast, but I would then beat myself up if I lost one or two, So it was just unhealthy, not gonna lie. It was very, it did not give whatsoever. But it was very much a learning experience for me. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I believe that everything happens for a reason. Gosh, I remembered when I did that podcast, it started to become like a chore almost. Man, I don't feel like doing this podcast, and it shouldn't be like that. I entered, that era of the Ethan Gonzalez, making a podcast because I love podcasts. I love listening to long episodes where either people spill tea or they, talk about real good stuff, What was I saying? But yeah, in all, it it wasn't stable, that podcast, even though I had so many goals and so many expectations for it. I feel like the way I approached it, like the idea was there. The idea, like, sige homie, like, come on now, that's a dope podcast. But like the execution didn't execution how I wanted it to, you know? So I basically abandoned that I ghosted that. No, I'm just playing. I kind of let go of that podcast for a while. I started that podcast summer of 2021, and then I wasn't as consistent. And then eventually at the beginning of 2022, I was like, I posted like another episode. I scratched all of my previous Sige Homie episodes, and I was like, hey y'all, this is episode 1. We're starting over. This is a new podcast, you know? And I kind of like went into how I was struggling with how I wanted to present myself, and, you know, just like my identity essentially. But even though I had so many plans, so many episodes, so many guests planned out, I didn't fulfill that. I didn't fulfill what I had said, which was like, oh, I'm gonna make all these episodes. And I'm really sorry for that, especially for those who really supported me during that time, like with Sige Homie. And really what brought me to now was, after that episode in January 2022, I hadn't touched Sige Homie in like almost over a year. And it just became forgotten. And the thing with me, and like when I create art, when I create things, is I want to be proud of it. I don't want it to just go into the closet, never to be touched again. You know, I want it to live, you feel? So essentially, so fast forward to summer 2023. I just got back from the Philippines and from California again. It was such an amazing summer. Like I can't even put it into words. It was such a nice vacation, a very needed vacation for my family and I. I'm planning to do an episode about that, so stay tuned. But we just came back, and really this summer I wanted to complete a lot of things that I hadn't really had the time to during like an academic school year because of, you know, school and assignments. And essentially, you know, I did that before school started. I was kind of like getting my life back together and doing things I wanted to do, like organizing my closets. I just got done with organizing my brother's closet, and we're now like giving away clothes to those who need it most. And it just feels nice. It's so therapeutic getting a lot of like stuff done. I've been organizing a lot of documents. I've been throwing a lot of stuff away and just, you know, getting my life together pretty much. And there came a point where like a couple weeks ago, I was driving and I was praying and I asked God, and I was like, Lord, what did I ask? I asked something along the lines of, what do you want me to do? You know? And immediately I thought of my podcast, and I was like, not the Sige Homie I thought he was gone. I was kind of scared to like get into the Sige Homie podcast again, because it was like, you know, I didn't really have the best experience with it. It kind of felt like a chore more than, you know, something that I like doing. But if anything, from the time I started that podcast, which was like summer 2021, to about 2 years later, I've learned so much, and I feel like I've developed as a person, and especially in the way I approach content creation now. It's so much different than how I was like years ago. And I think really like shifting topics now, what's different with this podcast compared to Sige Homie? I feel like number one is, I think my priorities are now different. from sige. As I mentioned, when I did sige, like, I was all about the views. I was all about the people pleasing, and now I really just want to create a podcast where everyone is welcome, where I'm able to build a community, that I'm able to represent God, but also that I'm able to share stories of my own experiences, but also allow guests or even people, general people, to have their voices amplified and to have their stories shared to an audience, so that we can ultimately like view life like in a better way, in a different perspective, and yeah, that's really just one of the main things that kind of changed. I think now how I approach podcasts is I'm not worried about how my voice sounds. That was one thing that I was worried about during the sige podcast was, oh man, like I have to make my voice like sound a certain way. I want it to, now it's like, at this point, I'm just gonna, like, I feel like I'm FaceTiming a friend, not gonna lie. Like, oh, what if like my double chin shows in the video? Like, at this point, no, like, let's not worry about that. Let's just vibe. Let's just have a good time. Honestly, that's, for me, on my end, that feels so freeing to just come to a point where you're not really worried about that, where you can just start over. That's why I kind of wanted to rebrand this podcast, was because I wanted to start over. I wanted this to be a new era, a completely new podcast with a different, vibe. And it's not like I'm completely like, I completely hate sige. Like, you have to be thankful in a way, because that podcast, thank God, like, I feel like God has humbled me a lot through that podcast, but he's taught me a lot as well. And so really, before we kind of, conclude this podcast, I kind of want to talk about as well how the name Visualize came about, right? We already went through, what does that mean? What is this podcast about? Essentially, Visualize came from my Instagram account. So I have 2 Instagram accounts that I like to make content on. Number one is my main one, my personal one, which is at the Ethan Gonzalez. You can follow if you want. You should definitely follow though. But my other account is called at Visualize by EJ, and I made it in 2021. It was meant for like a photography account, but I didn't want it to be like every other photography account. I wanted it to be a place where I'm able to also show my the photo shoots I do, and also like the film that I create, and just a lot of the things that I find cool in life. It was supposed to be like a visual, I like to describe it as like a spicy visual mood board, so yeah. That's where it came from. The way I approach that account is like, I want to be able to show people like how I view art, or how I wanted to show people like what I find cool in a visual sense. That's why it's like Visualize, because you're seeing it. Thinking about the name of the podcast, I mean, I was thinking like, man, Lord, how, like, what should the name be? And immediately like a thought came into my head. Oh, Visualize, like the Visualize podcast. I wanted to create this podcast. I wanted it to be different from how I made sige, and yeah. That's pretty much, the story with Visualize. I'm super excited about the future of this podcast. It's just so cool knowing that like you could start all over again, pretty much. I have so many different episodes and guests that I'm so excited to put on here on this podcast. We're gonna remain consistent, and I'm kind of saying that to myself. And yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. It's pretty short, I know, but it's the first episode. It's something new, obviously, but stay tuned for more episodes. One thing that I do want to say too is that from now on, every time you listen to this podcast, if you made it all the way up to here, thank you. I love you. Have some water with you. That's like the mandatory rule of this podcast, is to have a water bottle at hand. Truly, water is so good. Thank Jesus that we have water. It does some wonders, bro. It can clear skin. It can clear, I don't know. So yeah, I want that to be a mandatory rule. We're going to take a lot of water breaks as we talk. But I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. If you made it up to here, again, thank you. You are loved, you are special, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. Remember that. Thanks for vibing with me. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.